Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. Glad you could join us for another deep dive.
It's good to be here.
And this time we're going to be looking into a case that's really unsettling. The story of Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. You probably know him as the Golden State Killer.
Yeah, a case that really gripped the nation for decades, really.
Absolutely. And for so long, he was this phantom, this boogeyman that was just out there committing these horrific crimes, and nobody knew who he was.
Yeah, a true reminder that evil can sometimes lurk in the most mundane places.
Yeah, hiding in plain sight. And what's crazy is he was a police officer.
Right. Imagine that, a sworn protector of the peace committing these horrific acts.
It blows my mind. And it's not just the fact that he was a cop, but the scope of his crimes, it's just unbelievable. Over 120 burglaries, at least 50 rapes, 13 murders.
Yeah, and the fact that for years investigators didn't even realize these crimes were connected. It was like they were dealing with three different criminals: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker.
It's like something out of a horror movie. You know, you have these different names, these different personas, but it's all the same guy.
It really is. And that's part of what makes this case so fascinating and so terrifying.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of his crimes, let's rewind back to the beginning. Can you give us a little background on DeAngelo's early life?
Yeah.
What might have set him on this dark path?
Well, he was born in 1945 in Bath, New York, seemingly normal childhood, joined the Navy, served in Vietnam.
Okay, so nothing out of the ordinary so far.
Not really on the surface, at least, but even then there were whispers of some troubling behavior.
Whispers like what?
Well, there are reports, unconfirmed, but reports of burglary, mail theft, even animal cruelty when he was a teenager.
That's disturbing, especially considering what he would later become.
Right, and some relatives even claimed he witnessed the sexual assault of his sister when he was a child.
Wow, that's a heavy thing to carry with you.
Absolutely, though. It's important to note that those details are still murky.
Okay, so fast forward a bit, he gets out of the Navy, and then what?
Well, he gets a degree in criminal justice, of all things.
Criminal justice, seriously.
Yeah, the irony isn't lost on me either.
So the guy who had become this notorious criminal actually studied the criminal justice system.
Yep, and after graduating, he joins the police force?
You can't make this stuff up.
Yeah,
Like he was drawn to the dark side even then.
It's a strange twist of fate, isn't it? In 1973, he starts working as a police officer in Exeter, California. And get this, he was initially assigned to burglary units.
Oh, come on. You're kidding me, right?
Right.
A future serial burglar working in burglary prevention.
I know, it's almost too much to believe.
Talk about being in the lion's den.
But his career in law enforcement didn't last long.
What happened?
Well, in 1976, he gets transferred to the Auburn Police Department where he works until 1979, and then he gets fired.
Fight for what?
Shoplifting. Believe it or not, he was caught stealing a hammer and dog repellent from a drugstore.
A hammer and dog repellent.
Ugh.
Okay, now that sends shivers down my spine. Knowing what we know now about his crimes, you have to wonder if those items played a role in his attacks.
It's definitely a chilling thought. And to make matters worse, when he was being fired, he actually threatened to kill the police chief.
No way. Seriously.
Yeah, and he even reportedly stalked the chief's home for a while.
Okay, that's just creepy. It's like he was already starting to lose control.
It certainly seems that way. His aggression was escalating, and it wouldn't be long before that aggression would turn into something far more sinister.
So all of this is happening, and at the same time, he's getting married, he's having children, he's presenting this image of a normal family man.
Right, he was living this double life, a seemingly respectable citizen by day, a monster lurking in the shadows by night.
I mean, how do you even begin to reconcile those two sides of a person?
It's a question that psychologists and investigators have been grappling with for years.
It's just mind-boggling. But before we try to understand the psychology of a monster, let's get back to the crimes themselves.
Okay, so where do you want to start?
Let's start with his first foray into crime, the Visalia ransacker.
Okay, back in 1974, DeAngelo was still a police officer living in Exeter, and that's where his reign of terror begins.
But it starts with burglaries, right?
Mm.
Not the rapes and murders that he would later become infamous for.
Exactly. For about 2 years, he's believed to have committed over 120 burglaries in the Visalia area.
Wow, that's a lot of break-ins.
Mhm.
But what made these burglaries the work of the Visalia ransacker? What set them apart from your average burglary?
Well, for one thing, he would often ransack the homes he broke into, completely turning the place upside down. It was like he was looking for something specific, but never finding it.
Almost like he was sending a message.
Right. He would also steal strange things, seemingly random, low-value items. Like sometimes he would ignore cash altogether and just take a single piece of jewelry or a souvenir.
That's bizarre. Doesn't sound like he was in it for the money.
No, it was something more than that. He also developed this habit of leaving behind what investigators called warning items.
Warning items. What do you mean?
Things like dishes precariously balanced on doors or a drawer left slightly open. Just little things that would unnerve the homeowners when they came back.
Okay, that's creepy. It's like he was enjoying the fear he was causing.
Exactly. He was getting off on the psychological torment he was inflicting on his victims.
And these burglaries, they eventually escalate into something far more sinister, right?
They do. In 1975, DeAngelo breaks into the home of Claude Snelling, a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias.
This is where things take a dark turn.
It is. It's believed that DeAngelo had attempted to kidnap Snelling's daughter a few months prior, but Snelling had chased him off. This time, Snelling interrupts DeAngelo's attempted kidnapping and is fatally shot.
So his first known murder, a chilling turning point in DeAngelo's criminal career.
It was. And sadly, it wouldn't be his last. But that's a story for another time.
Before we move on, I want to remind our listeners that if you're enjoying this deep dive, be sure to hit that subscribe button and follow Tell Me More. You won't want to miss the rest of this twisted tale.
There's so much more to uncover. Trust me, you'll want to hear what happens next.
Okay, so after the Snelling murder, the ransackings continue, and the police are getting closer to cashing him. There's actually a close call in December of 1975.
Oh, absolutely. There was this stakeout where Detective William McGowan was hiding in a garage waiting for DeAngelo to strike again.
Wow, that must have been intense.
It was DeAngelo shows up, McGowan tries to apprehend him, there's a struggle, shots are fired, but DeAngelo manages to escape.
So close. But he doesn't get away scot-free, right?
No, he leaves behind some interesting evidence. Blue chip stamps and a sock full of coins.
Blue chip stamps and a sock full of coins. What does that even mean?
Well, at the time, investigators didn't know what to make of it. But those seemingly random items would later play a crucial role in connecting DeAngelo to the crimes.
I see. So even in his escape, he left behind clues that would eventually lead to his downfall.
That's the thing about serial criminals. They always leave a trail, even if it's a trail of seemingly insignificant details.
Well, this close call must have rattled him, because shortly after this, DeAngelo vanishes from Visalia.
He does. It's like he just disappeared into thin air, leaving behind a community living in fear and a trail of unanswered questions.
But as we know, his story was far from over. In fact, his reign of terror was just beginning.
And it's almost like a ghost story, he's just gone.
But like you said, his story wasn't over. He was just getting started, right?
Oh yeah, DeAngelo was just getting warmed up. In 1976, he relocates to the Sacramento area, and this is where his crimes take a really dark turn.
This is where we meet the East Area rapist.
That's right. He goes from the Visalia ransacker, this burglar who left behind these weird little clues, to the East Area rapist, a full-blown predator.
That's a huge jump going from burglary to rape.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think triggered that escalation?
It's tough to say for sure, but some experts believe that the attempted kidnapping of Snelling's daughter and then the murder, that was a turning point for DeAngelo.
You think that act of violence awakened something in him?
Possibly. It's like it unlocked this dark desire, this need for control and domination that went beyond just breaking into houses.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
So he moves to Sacramento, and the East Area rapist is born. What was his MO during this phase? What kind of things was he doing?
Well, he was very meticulous in his planning. He would stalk his victims, learn their routines. Sometimes he'd even make harassing phone calls beforehand.
He would call them before he attacked them.
Yeah, sometimes for months, just to torment them, really freak them out.
That's messed up. And then he would break into their homes at night, usually when they were alone, and threaten them with a gun.
Right, and then he would tie them up, blindfold them, and gag them.
It's just so brutal and degrading.
It was all about control and humiliation for him.
But he didn't always target women who were home alone, did he? I thought he started attacking couples at some point.
You're right, he did. It seems like maybe he changed his MO in response to the media coverage at the time. They were focusing on his attacks on single women, so he switched to couples.
And his attacks on couples were even more sadistic, weren't they?
Yeah, he would tie up the man and often put a stack of dishes on his back and then tell him that if he heard the dishes rattle, he would kill him and his partner.
Oh my God, that is just evil. Just toying with them like that.
It was all part of his game. And there's this one case where he actually says, "I hate you, Bonnie," during the attack.
I remember reading about that. Who was Bonnie?
Bonnie Jean Colwell was DeAngelo's college sweetheart. They were engaged, but she broke it off with him a few years before his first attack because he was becoming really controlling and abusive.
Maybe he was taking out his rage on other women.
It's possible. Some investigators believe that Bonnie's rejection was a major driving force behind his crimes.
A broken heart turned him into a monster. I mean, I guess that's one way to put it.
It's probably more complicated than that, but it's certainly a factor to consider.
There was that weird punishment map that they found, right?
Oh, yeah, that thing was bizarre. It was a hand-drawn map with all these strange symbols and phrases on it.
Do you think he was planning future attacks?
It's possible some people think it was a map of locations where he had already committed crimes, or maybe places that had some personal significance for him.
We may never know for sure. It's just another piece of the puzzle that makes this case so intriguing and so disturbing.
Right, and then there were the phone calls.
Oh, yeah, he was notorious for those, wasn't he?
He would call his victims after the attacks, taunt them, brag about what he had done.
And he would call the police, too, wouldn't he?
Oh, yeah, he left a toy with them. He'd call them up, threaten to strike again just to keep them on edge.
I bet they were just dying to catch him.
Oh, they were. They put a lot of resources into trying to track him down, but he was always one step ahead.
And then he just vanishes again, right?
Yeah.
This time from Sacramento?
Yep. In 1979, after a final rape in June, he just disappears. And that's when the original Night Stalker emerges down in Southern California.
So, new location, new name, same guy.
That's right. But for a long time, investigators didn't realize it was the same perpetrator. It wasn't until much later that they were able to connect the dots.
That's crazy to think that he was able to operate under the radar like that for so long.
And it gets worse. Down in Southern California, the violence escalates significantly.
What do you mean? How so?
Well, his attacks become much more brutal. He's not just raping women anymore, he's beating them savagely, sometimes even killing them.
Oh, man, that's just awful.
It's like he just completely lost control. He's using whatever he can find as weapons, household items, blunt objects. It's really disturbing.
And he's still targeting couples.
Right. His primary targets are now couples, and his attacks are terrifying. The first one down in Southern California happens in October of 1979 in Goleta.
Tell me about it.
Well, he breaks into this house, ties up a couple, and it seems like he's about to attack them when the woman screams and alerts the neighbors.
Another close call.
He manages to escape on a bicycle.
Of course he does.
Yeah.
He's like a ghost, this guy. But he doesn't stay quiet for long, does he?
No. Just a few months later, in December of 79, he strikes again, this time in Goleta. He fatally shoots a couple, Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning, in their condo.
So this is his first confirmed murder in Southern California.
Right, a chilling escalation of violence.
Did investigators think these two attacks were connected?
They suspected they were, but at this point they still didn't realize it was the East Area rapist who was responsible.
And the attacks just keep coming, don't they?
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
He murders Charlene and Lyman Smith in their Ventura home in March of 1980. Then, in August of that same year, he kills Keith and Patrice Harrington in Dana Point. And in February of 81, he attacks and murders Manuela Withon in Irvine while her husband's in the hospital.
It's just unbelievable how many lives he destroyed.
And it doesn't stop there. In July of 81, he kills another couple, Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez, in Goleta.
5 murders in just over 2 years. This guy was a killing machine.
And with some of these murders, a new piece of evidence emerges, a diamond knot.
What do you mean?
Well, investigators found a diamond knot used to bind some of the victims. It was this really distinctive knot that they hadn't seen before.
And this diamond knot, it starts showing up at other crime scenes.
It does. They find it at the Smith murder scene and then again at the Domingo Sanchez murder scene.
So it's like a calling card, a signature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at the time, they still couldn't connect these murders to the East Area rapist. They just didn't have the technology back then.
The technology, like DNA testing?
Right. But that would come later. For now, they were stuck with these tantalizing clues, these little pieces of the puzzle that they couldn't quite put together.
And it must have been incredibly frustrating for them knowing that this guy was out there and they were so close to catching him but just couldn't quite connect the dots.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't just the physical evidence. They also had these glimpses into his psyche, these things that really gave you a sense of who they were dealing with.
Like what?
Well, in December of 1977, after a series of rapes in Sacramento, someone claiming to be the East Area rapist sent a poem to a few newspapers.
A poem? Seriously, what kind of poem?
It was called Excitement's Crave, and it was basically a taunt, bragging about his crimes and threatening to strike again.
Do you think it was really him?
Most investigators believe it was like the language, the tone, it all fits with his profile.
That's creepy. And then there were the phone calls, right?
Oh, yeah, the phone calls were terrifying. He would call his victims, months or even years after the attacks just to remind them that he was still out there.
And he would call the police too, wouldn't he? Just to mess with them.
He loved to play games. He'd call them up, give them little clues, trying to lead them on a wild goose chase.
That's so messed up. It's like he was getting off on the attention.
I think he was. He wanted to be famous. He wanted everyone to know his name.
And sadly, he got his wish. But before we talk about how he was finally caught, there's one more thing I want to ask you about. There's a 5-year period where the attacks just stop. What happened during that time?
Yeah, it's this weird quiet period between 1981 and 1986 where there are no known attacks, no phone calls, no nothing. It's like he just disappeared.
What do you think he was doing?
Your guess is as good as mine. Some people think he was laying low. Maybe he got married, had kids, tried to live a normal life for a while.
It's hard to believe that someone who is capable of such horrific acts could just flip a switch and become a normal, functioning member of society.
I know, it's hard to fathom. But then in 1986, the silence is broken. He resurfaces and commits one final murder, that of 18-year-old Janelle Cruz in Irvine.
And then he just vanishes again.
Yep. And that's where the trail goes cold for decades.
It's crazy to think that he got away with it for so long. But as we know, the story doesn't end there. Advances in forensic science and the tireless work of investigators would eventually lead to his capture.
And that's what we'll talk about in the final part of our deep dive, the investigation, the arrest, and the long-awaited justice for the victims of the Golden State Killer.
It's hard to believe that one man could be responsible for so much pain, so many lives destroyed.
Yeah, it's a truly horrifying thought, and for so long it seemed like he would just get away with it.
Decades went by, the case went cold, and yet those memories of his crimes, they lingered like a shadow over those communities.
And the families of the victims, they never gave up hope. They always believed that one day he would be caught.
And they were right. Eventually, science caught up with him. DNA technology became more advanced, and investigators were finally able to track him down.
It was a long time coming, but justice was finally served.
So how did they do it? How did they finally catch the Golden State Killer after all these years?
Well, it all started with a website called GE Match.
GED Match. What's that?
It's a genealogy website where people can upload their DNA information to try to find relatives, build their family trees.
Okay, so what does that have to do with the Golden State Killer?
Well, investigators had a DNA sample from one of the crime scenes, and they uploaded it to GED Match to see if they could find any matches.
Wait, so you're telling me they found a relative of the Golden State Killer through this website?
They did. It wasn't an exact match, but it was close enough to narrow down the search.
Wow, that's incredible. So from there, they were able to identify DeAngelo as a suspect.
Exactly. They started following him, collecting more DNA evidence to confirm their suspicions.
And it was a match.
It was on April 24, 2018. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights.
What a moment that must have been. After all those years, they finally had him.
It was a huge victory for law enforcement and for the victims and their families.
So what happened when they arrested him? What was his reaction?
Well, at first he seemed confused, like he had no idea what was going on.
Really?
He didn't even try to deny it.
Not at first. But once they read him his rights and told him why they were there, his demeanor changed.
Oh, so...
He became very withdrawn, emotionless. He eventually confessed to the crimes, but he claimed that he was driven by an alternate personality named Jerry.
Jerry, seriously.
Yeah.
An alternate personality, that's his defense.
It seemed like a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility.
I can imagine the victims and their families weren't buying it.
No, they weren't. They saw it for what it was, a pathetic excuse.
So what happened at his trial?
Well, it was a very emotional trial. Lots of the victims and their families gave impact statements, talking about how DeAngelo's crimes had affected their lives. I bet that was powerful.
Oh, it was heartbreaking to hear their stories, to see the pain that he had caused.
And how did DeAngelo react to all of this? Did he show any remorse?
Not really. He mostly just sat there staring blankly ahead.
Wow, no apology, no explanation, nothing.
Nope. He never really took responsibility for his actions.
What a coward. So what was his sentence?
He was sentenced to 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Wow, so he'll die in prison.
He will. Justice was finally served.
It's just such a tragic case. So many lives were destroyed by this one man's actions.
It's a reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places.
Well, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a fascinating and sobering discussion.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast for more captivating true crime stories. Until next time, stay curious.